In order to think about the role of fast processes in non-inferentially justified judgments, it might be interesting to think about an old experiment from Hyder and Simmel from the 1950s. They created a display a bit like this one. This is not an exact replication, involving some triangles and circles moving around. What I'd like you to do is to just think for a minute, what do you see happening here? Ooh. Oh, you're seeing a rescue attempt. Good. So that's actually, that rescue attempt idea, that's actually what many people say. So what Hyder and Simmel noticed in this classic study was that many of the subjects, nearly all of them, would talk about, the big triangle attacking the small one, the big triangle, oh God, it's getting really cross now. The big triangle attacking the small circle, the small triangle attempting to rescue it, and so on. So they had quite a coherent story about what was going on in this picture. And research since then, probably roughly 70 years of research, I'd guess, has shown that this idea holds up, and indeed in more carefully controlled experiments, one can create very strong impressions of agency, of interactions between objects and so on, using very minimal moving objects. What's this got to do with fast processes? Well, here's a thought. On the one hand, I'm asking you to make a judgment in a fairly slow way. So to watch what's happening, to think about it, take as long as you want and think, what just happened there? You can spend a long time thinking about it, and you will eventually come to this judgment about what happened. At the same time, of course, you and I know that this is just a series of moving triangles. Really, essentially, there are patterns of light, and there's no even possibility of causal interaction here on the screen. So we wouldn't, strictly speaking, judge that the big triangle was attacking the small triangle or anything like that, but we have a very strong impression that it might be. Now, here's the curious thing. Imagine that we lived in a universe where you and I had no idea about the true nature of this display. We had no idea about the true nature of this display. So we had no way of understanding that, it was just patterns of light and it was fabricated in this way. In that situation, I think, we would still have these very strong impressions of agency, one thing being cross, chasing another, protecting, attacking, and so on. But we wouldn't have any way of, nothing to contradict those. So we might well, on reflection, spend a while reflecting on this and come to a view about what these things are doing and what kind of things they are, which of course would be entirely mistaken. So here we are in the loose reconstruction of Green's argument. We've just been talking about the idea in the previous section that we shouldn't rely on fast processes in unfamiliar situations. Now, in the next steps of the argument, we have to make that relevant to ethics. And in order to do that, the first step is to say, when philosophers rely on non-justified-inferentially premises, they're relying on faster processes. Well, is that true? Is that true? What I've just been suggesting using Hyder and Simmel is that there are cases where faster processes can influence non-justified-inferentially judgments, even very slow judgments. But you might object, you might say, I think there are people who say this, research on fast processes just isn't relevant here because philosophers considering moral scenarios are thinking very slowly about them. Now, I think it's true that philosophers are thinking very slowly here. In fact, one of my favourite philosophers, John Campbell, says that philosophy is thinking in slow motion. That's what philosophy is. And I would agree with that. I think that's exactly right. So no question at all that the philosophers are thinking very slowly. It doesn't follow from that, though, that research on fast processes is not relevant. Now, in order to see why, I want to take you back to something that we considered in the preview. So this is an experiment where subjects are asked to take the perspective of the arrow, so they're looking into this tube, and they're supposed to launch a pea or some kind of projectile into the tube here at high velocity, and then draw the trajectory of the pea as it exits the tube. And what McCluskey and colleagues noticed is that just about half of their subjects drew a spiral trajectory, Just about half of their subjects drew a spiral trajectory. The interesting question, of course, is, well, why? Why would you do that? This is not something that any of them could ever have observed. It's impossible to observe this because it's physically impossible. So why would the subjects have drawn the spiral trajectory? Well, the results of Koznevnikov and Hegarty on objects launched vertically suggest a very attractive answer. It's because fast processes give the appearance that objects move in certain ways. Now, what are we saying here? We've got to be very careful. We're not saying that the fast processes directly influence the judgment about trajectory. This is a very slow judgment. Think about it, spend as much time as you want, and then draw with a pencil. Draw with a pencil. It's not like a particularly rapid judgment. So we're not saying that it's just driven by the fast processes. Somehow you're compelled to make this judgment regardless of what you know. On the contrary, people who've been trained in physics would be much less likely to make this mistake. They're much more likely to draw the correct trajectory, which is a straight line. So we're not saying that somehow the fast processes seize control of the hand and force it to move in a spiral. That's not the idea. What we're saying rather is something like this. Just as in the Hyder and Simmel case, so in the case of physical motion, the operation of fast processes gives rise to phenomenal effects. And those phenomenal effects then form material for judgment. And when you or I don't have a better understanding, a deeper understanding, we tend to rely on those appearances. So let me say this again. We're responding to the objection that the fast processes are simply not relevant because ethicists, considering moral scenarios, are thinking slowly. Now, the observation is that physicists in the Aristotelian tradition were also thinking very slowly about physical scenarios, for example, those involving the behaviours of objects launched vertically. They were thinking very slowly about those and, even writing books about them, right? You can't get much slower than that. But their judgments nevertheless reflect and relied on the operation of the fast processes. There's no way that they could have arrived at the judgments that they did, but for the operation of the fast processes. Why do I say that? Their judgments were incorrect. They were making judgments about scenarios which were physically impossible. Right? So they literally could not have seen what they were claiming to predict. Couldn't be based on observation, couldn't be based on learning about the physical world. The only other alternative then is that it is a consequence, or not the only, almost the only other alternative is that it is a consequence of the way the fast processes for physical cognition operate. The principles encoded in them giving rise to experiences, illusions, if you like, of the physical. That's why they made the judgments that they did. So here we've got people who are thinking slowly, but their judgments, although not directly caused by, are shaped by the fast processes. So what am I saying? How does the fast process influence the slow judgment? Well, not directly, or at least if it does, it's not a significant factor. So it may be that all judgments are consequences of multiple processes, but we would expect the slower processes to dominate. Here's the idea. The fast process gives rise to an appearance that something will move on a certain trajectory, or we saw this with regard to representational momentum, for example, or that something is attacking or threatening or protecting and so on. The fast process is giving rise to these appearances. It's also generating high subjective confidence. It's also generating high subjective confidence. When a fast process gives rise to an appearance, one initially has a fairly high subjective confidence in that judgment because it comes very fluently and readily to mind. One is generally very convinced about the deliverances of the fast processes. And this is true, interestingly, even for experts. So I don't think it's been tested with philosophers, but it's true with experts in other domains. Then what happens is that there's a reflection on appearance, and that can influence the slow judgment. Now, of course, this reflection can also be overridden through time, although sometimes it's quite difficult to do that. The historical struggles over physics show that people can be quite attached to their appearances for a long time, even in the face of strong evidence against them. People are often very reluctant to give up on this, probably because they have that high subjective confidence, and perhaps also some political reasons, but that's not our deal, right? Now the reflection on appearance, it doesn't determine what you judge. That's the important thing. So if you have good theoretical knowledge, you're free to say, actually, this is going to move in a straight line rather than a spiral. If you have good theoretical knowledge, you're free to say, look, it's not that the big circle is attacking the small circle. This is just a kind of, an illusion created by patterns of moving light that have been coordinated in a certain way. You're free to say those things. So there's no guarantee that the reflection on appearance has to influence the judgment. But very often, humans find themselves with nothing but the appearance to go on. And in that case, of course, it does determine the slow judgment, very often. So the idea is very simple. The fast process does not directly influence the slow judgment, but it does provide material for the slow judgment. Just here we come to this point where you could say, Steve, you've diffused an objection. You said there's no problem at all with explaining a slow judgment by means to a fast process operating indirectly via giving rise to appearances. But you haven't given me a positive argument. Why should we accept that this is how non-justified inferentially ethical judgments work? Why should we accept that these judgments are a consequence of the fast processes indirectly? Why should we accept that? The answer, I think, is simple. There's nothing else but the fast processes that could give rise to the not justified inferentially judgments. There is literally no other known capacity. Now, of course, that's not to say this is a matter of logic. So there could in principle be some undiscovered ethical ability, ethical faculty, which provides humans with some sort of direct relation to ethical truths. Right? What I have to tell you is that there's no trace of that. There's no trace of that right now. And indeed, there's also no special reason to think that there should be one. There's no need to postulate such a thing. So what we have this situation. Fast processes are a good candidate to explain not justified inferentially judgments about ethics, and there's no alternative candidate available. Right? It's not a demonstrative argument, but I think that's quite compelling. So here's our situation. We ask the question, when philosophers rely on not justified inferentially premises, are they relying on faster processes? And here I think you really have a very simple choice. You can hold on to the view that philosophers are magic, or you can accept that philosophers are like everything else and that ethical judgments work in roughly the same way that judgments about agency or judgments about the physical world or judgments about number work, judgments about mind. By the way, you can accept that they work in that way, and in this case you give a positive answer to the question. The not justified inferentially premises are to large extent consequence of the faster processes. That's the basis that we know could explain them. And that's why I think we should accept this premise of the loose reconstruction of Green's argument. It's true that when philosophers rely on not justified inferentially premises, they're relying on faster processes.